I want to discuss why scientism, that's blind faith in physical explanations in terms of physical laws, actually doesn't make sense. It's useful as a device, but as a source of reality statements, as a way of finding out what the world is really about, it's incomplete. And to make it complete, to imagine that it's complete, leads to an illogical, inconsistent worldview. I want to explain why that is. And to do that, I need to talk something about the difference between being subjective and being objective. When, at the time of the Renaissance, a lot of knowledge was subjective. For example, Thomas Aquinas, he'd introduced Aristotle's views. Aristotle wasn't actually a scientist in the sense he didn't do a lot of experimentation and observation. He came to conclusions by some process of his own. And then Aquinas expected everybody to accept these conclusions. This is just an example. So what the early scientists wanted was a way of coming to conclusions that were really reliable and didn't rely on my opinion, my authority over anybody else's, regardless of whether I actually had any facts to go on. So they said that we want to go on facts. We want to look at what's actually happening in the world, and we'll deal with actual observations of what's going on in the world. So this led to the idea of the objective method. In other words, they're going to deal with objects, things that are out there, and preferably they wanted that they could describe them objectively. Means that I can look at something, you can look at something, you can look at something, and you can describe it in the same terms. So of course it's very convenient if you can measure it. You measure the length, you measure the weight, you measure the velocity, and they wanted to deal with objects as much as possible. And therefore this gave rise to the objective method. And gradually they lost faith in the subjective. Subjective means what's going on in my mind, my thoughts, my feelings, my opinions, things that can't be verified by anybody else. You don't know if I'm simply by looking, you can't tell really whether I'm happy, whether I'm sad, whether I'm preoccupied, what I think, any of these things. These are subjective.
My experience.
Yeah. So what they wanted, the early scientists wanted to confine themselves to objects, and as much as possible to keep subjective values out of the way, because that way they could build up intersubjective reliability. In other words, any number of scientists could make the same observations and reach the same results and then come to the same logical conclusions. That was their idea. Of course, when you've got this intersubjective verifiability, immediately they're admitting that there's a lot of subjects, intersubjective. But the early scientists wanted to keep the subject out of their observations. It didn't mean to say that they were dismissing the subject. Descartes, for example, he believed in the existence of the self, and he believed in the existence of God. Newton, the same. But gradually, as the scientists became more and more successful in their objective observations, they put more and more emphasis on objective observations and less emphasis on the subject and on subjective values. Finally, they came to the conclusion, or not finally, gradually they came to the conclusion that only objective knowledge is really reliable. Any other kind of knowledge is not science, it's not real knowledge. And then after a bit, they went further and they said that anything which we can't describe and explain through the objective method doesn't exist. It's not real. The only things that are real are those things that we can observe and measure using the objective method. So the subject, they removed the subject completely from the field of science. And having done that, having removed the source of the scientific impulse, the source of the consciousness which is actually giving rise to the experience, then they introduced huge anomalies whenever they came to talking about consciousness. They were trying to say that consciousness and life are just physical phenomena, that matter gives rise to elementary living organisms, and when the organisms build up, when the complexity comes up, then they become conscious, And in this way, self comes. So this was their intention. This is the way that they tried to explain it. So this is the distinction between subjective values, subjective observations, and objective observations.